Point Pleasant, West Virginia. November 15th, 1966, late past most of the town's bedtime. Two young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette, are driving out past the edge of town toward an old abandoned stretch of land people call the TNT area. Wartime buildings out there, concrete domes half swallowed by trees. They pass the old power plant. Something catches the headlights. Two eyes, red, reflecting the light straight back at them, spaced too far apart to be anything they can name. Steve sees it first. Doesn't say anything at first, just points. The car is already moving before anyone decides to move it. Something keeps pace outside the windows, not running behind them, beside them. Nobody in the car says a word until the town lights come up around them. What the two couples reported to police that night was specific enough to write down. A creature roughly 6 to 7 feet tall, gray or brown, with a wingspan they estimated near 10 feet. Red eyes, about 2 inches across, set 6 to 8 inches apart, no visible head, the eyes seeming to sit directly into the shoulders. Steve Millette put it plainly afterward. It was like a man with wings. Not like anything on television, not like a monster movie. The part of the account that got the most attention wasn't the sighting itself, it was the chase. All 4 witnesses described the thing keeping pace with their car at speeds they placed over 100 miles an hour without visibly flapping its wings, only breaking off once they crossed into town. They went straight to the Mason County Courthouse and gave their account to the sheriff that same night. The next morning, the Point Pleasant Register ran it on the front page. The headline read, "Couples see man-sized bird, creature, something." That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Most cryptid cases get reconstructed years after the fact from memory, filtered through decades of retelling. This one has a dated newspaper on record within hours of the report, while the witnesses were still shaken enough to go straight to the sheriff instead of home. Once the story ran, more accounts followed. A gravedigger named Kenneth Duncan came forward and said he'd seen something similar 3 days earlier, on November 12th, gliding low over a cemetery outside Clendenin, 30 miles away. He hadn't reported it. He'd only mentioned it to a few friends until the Register story gave him a reason to. Over the following 13 months, more than 100 separate reports would come in from the area, most describing the same broad shape, tall, winged, red-eyed, seen at night near the edges of town. The place all of this centers on has its own history, and it starts 20 years before anyone reported a creature. During the Second World War, the Army built the West Virginia Ordnance Works here, 8,300 acres, 3,500 workers, producing roughly 500,000 pounds of TNT a day at its peak. Close to 100 concrete igloo bunkers were built into the hillsides to store the explosives, low and domed, designed specifically not to stand out from the air. The war ended. The plant closed in 1945. Most of the land sat abandoned, turned over decades later for wildlife management. But the bunkers stayed, concrete shells slowly disappearing back into the trees. The chemical runoff didn't disappear as easily. Decades of TNT production had left contamination in the soil and groundwater severe enough that the site was added to the federal Superfund list in 1983. And long before 1966, locals already treated the TNT area as the kind of place you didn't go after dark. That reputation existed independently of anything with wings. 1966 was not a quiet year to feel like something was watching from the tree line. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 4 years gone, not 40. Civil defense drills were still routine in West Virginia schools. UFO reports were climbing nationally, and West Virginia's own count was part of that rise. Within the same 13-month window as the sightings, the area also produced reports of unmarked cars, men in dark suits asking pointed questions, telephones ringing with electronic static instead of voices. Locals began calling the strangest of the visitors men in black, a term the case helped popularize well beyond West Virginia. None of that shows the reports were connected to each other, but it does describe the atmosphere they landed in. A Cold War town, already primed to take an unexplained shape seriously, sitting right next to a literal abandoned military site built to hide things from aerial view. Put those two pieces together, and the shape of the legend stops looking arbitrary. This wasn't a sighting that could have happened anywhere. It needed a specific kind of landscape, a real abandoned military site, already carrying a reputation, built with structures deliberately designed to be hidden from above. And it needed a specific kind of moment, a country primed by a decade of missile crises and UFO headlines to take an unexplained shape in the dark seriously enough to report it to the sheriff instead of laughing it off. Take away the TNT area and there's no obvious place for the story to start. Take away 1966 and there's no obvious reason 100 people spend the next year filing reports instead of staying quiet. The land and the era don't explain away what people saw, but they explain why the story had somewhere to live once people saw it. 13 months after the first sighting, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River during evening rush hour, carrying Route 35 traffic between Point Pleasant and Gallipolis, Ohio. 46 people died. 2 of them were never recovered. The cause, established by investigators within the following year, was a single defective eye-bar in the suspension chain, a crack roughly 1/10 of an inch deep, grown slowly through corrosion, that failed all at once under the weight of holiday traffic. It was a structural failure, metal fatigue in a 40-year-old bridge, not weather, not sabotage, not anything else. The reports of the creature stopped after that night. They did not resume. In the years after, the sightings and the bridge collapse became linked in the public retelling, the creature recast as a warning nobody heeded. That link is worth being precise about. It is a folk explanation that formed after the tragedy, not a claim this film is making, and not one the available evidence supports as literal prediction. Folklorist Jack Daly, writing in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 2023, studied exactly this pattern and gave it a name: narrative hijacking. His research traces how the historical fact of the collapse, a real engineering failure that killed 46 people, became gradually absorbed into the mythology, until for many outside the town, the bridge is remembered mainly as the place where the story ends, rather than as the disaster it actually was. Inside the town, the relationship is more complicated than that. Point Pleasant built a museum for the case in 2006, raised a 12-foot statue downtown in 2003, and has hosted an annual festival since 2002 that now draws tens of thousands of visitors a year to a town of roughly 4,000 people. Some residents describe it as economic lifeline. Others describe it as a story that profits from a tragedy that still has surviving family in town. Both of those are real positions, held by real people, not a contradiction this film needs to resolve. Set the sociology aside for a moment and ask the narrower biological question: what would a person driving past the TNT area at night in 1966 actually have been looking at? The leading candidate, offered at the time by West Virginia University wildlife biologist Robert L. Smith, is the sandhill crane, a bird nearly as tall as a person, with reddish coloring around the eyes and a wingspan that can reach 6.5 to 7 feet. A later analysis by researcher Daniel Reed argued that in cases without a clearly reported eyeshine, a great blue heron, similar in size, is statistically the more likely match given the bird's actual range and migration timing in the area. A third candidate has a physical object behind it. In 1966, a large snowy owl was shot near Point Pleasant, and it's now on display at the Mothman Museum. Author Joe Nickell has argued that several owl species, not just the snowy owl, plausibly account for multiple reports in the case. Here's the gap: none of these fully close. Witnesses consistently estimated a wingspan near 10 feet. The sandhill crane, the great blue heron, and the snowy owl all fall well short of that, several feet short in the owl's case. A misidentified bird explains the shape in the dark, the eyeshine, the wings. It does not fully explain the size witnesses kept independently reporting. That gap is exactly why the biological question and the sociological question have to stay separate. Even a generous misidentification theory explains individual sightings. It does not, by itself, explain why more than 100 separate reports accumulated in 13 months, why they clustered specifically around a town already living inside a wider atmosphere of Cold War anxiety and UFO coverage, or why the reports stopped precisely at the Silver Bridge collapse and never meaningfully resumed after. John Keel, the writer who spent over a year in Point Pleasant conducting more than 100 witness interviews, documented that pattern in real time, not reconstructed decades later. Whatever people were seeing, the clustering and spread of the reports is itself a real documented social phenomenon, sitting on top of, and separate from, the individual question of what any one witness looked at. A debunked bird sighting is not the same claim as a debunked social pattern. Only one of those two things has actually been debunked. Here is what the evidence does not support: a living, unclassified winged species native to a few hundred acres of West Virginia and nowhere else on record. No specimen, no remains, no biological trace has ever surfaced in 58 years, and the leading bird candidates, while plausible for individual sightings, do not fully account for the size witnesses kept reporting. Here is what genuinely happened here and deserves to be taken just as seriously. A documented 13-month reporting event, logged in real time by a dated local newspaper rather than reconstructed from memory years later, which is genuinely rare in this kind of case. A real disaster that killed 46 people with a known engineering cause, that a grieving town has spent decades processing through a legend it did not ask for, and by some accounts is still ambivalent about, and an ongoing relationship between that town and its own story, studied directly by folklorists rather than assumed by outsiders. None of that proves anything watched those 4 teenagers from the tree line in 1966. What holds up 58 years later is simpler. A place and a moment gave an unexplained shape somewhere to live, and a town decided the story was worth keeping. Point Pleasant still holds its festival every September. The museum is still open on Main Street. 58 years on, nobody in town claims to have solved what happened in November of 1966. They just decided it was theirs to keep telling.